Digital splendor. Literature, illuminated.
You know, some stories just describe history, but then there are stories that are history. When a person who has lived through something truly immense finally gets the chance to tell their own story in their own words, well, the world is forced to listen in a whole new way. And we're about to explore one of the most powerful of those stories.
For centuries, the history of slavery was written almost exclusively by the masters. It was their version of events. But back in the 1840s, that started to change. The abolitionist Wendell Phillips really captured this shift perfectly in a letter to Frederick Douglass himself. He said that the time had finally come for the lions, the enslaved, to write their own history.
And that is exactly what Frederick Douglass did. After escaping what he called the Southern prison house of bondage, he put pen to paper to show the world the brutal reality of the system that tried to crush him. This wasn't some second-hand account, it was a first-hand testimony.
So, where does Douglass begin his story? Not with theories or arguments, but with a memory, a horrific, defining moment from his childhood that he could never, ever forget. This was his real introduction to what slavery was. He frames this memory with these absolutely chilling words. As a very young boy, he witnessed the whipping of his own Aunt Hester. For him, this wasn't just a single act of cruelty. It was the very threshold, the bloody entrance to the hell he was born into. The scene unfolds with this cold, procedural horror. His master found out that his aunt had disobeyed an order, and so the punishment began. He took her into the kitchen and stripped her bare to the waist, preparing her for what was coming.
Then, he forced her up onto a stool, made her stretch her arms as high as they could go, and tied her hands to a hook in the ceiling. She was left totally exposed, totally defenseless, standing on just the tips of her toes.
The weapon was a heavy cowskin whip. Douglass describes watching his master roll up his sleeves and just begin the assault, lashing her back over and over again.
Young Frederick was so terrified that he actually hid himself in a closet. He just listened to the screams and the awful curses of his master. He watched until the blood started dripping to the floor. And that image, it was burned into his memory forever.
But Douglass's life wasn't only defined by this kind of brutality. A move to Baltimore when he was a young boy introduced him to a completely different world, and, completely by accident, to the secret of his own freedom.
So his new mistress, a woman named Sophia Auld, had never owned a slave before. And in what Douglass describes as just this act of pure kindness, she started teaching him how to read. I mean, for a boy who had only known cruelty from white people, this was absolutely revolutionary.
But that kindness came to a screeching halt. When her husband, Master Hugh Auld, found out, he was furious. He forbade her from teaching Douglass another letter. And in his rage, he accidentally revealed the entire philosophy of slavery's power. He argued that learning would make a slave unmanageable, discontented, and ultimately worthless as property. For Douglass, hearing this was like a lightning bolt. His master's angry words didn't discourage him, they enlightened him. He suddenly understood the secret to the white man's power over the black man. So what his master meant as a tool of oppression, Douglass took as a key to his own liberation. All of a sudden, he had a clear mission. He realized that the pathway from slavery to freedom was through the very thing his master feared the most: education. But walking that path was anything but easy. As Douglass started to learn more and more about the world, his newfound knowledge became both this incredible blessing and at the same time a source of unbearable pain. His world was now split in two. On the plantation, it was just constant hunger and cruelty with no checks, no balances. But in the city, slaves were generally better fed, and the simple presence of non-slave-holding neighbors created what he called a vestige of decency. A city slave, he wrote, was almost a freeman by comparison. This new reality just opened his eyes to how deeply unjust his condition truly was.
And this bigger worldview led to a question that absolutely tortured him. I mean, what good is it to be aware of your chains if you have no way to break them?
He described his torment with this really powerful metaphor. Reading gave him the words to understand his own suffering, but it didn't offer any immediate escape. He could see the horrible pit of slavery with perfect clarity, but he couldn't see a ladder, no way to climb out. The anguish was so deep that he often found himself envying his fellow slaves for their ignorance. This everlasting thinking about his condition was a constant torment. It got so bad he wished he could be a beast, an animal, anything,
just to get rid of the thoughts that were plaguing him.
But Douglass didn't stay in that despair. Instead, he channeled all of that anguish into action. He realized that reading was only half the battle. He needed to learn how to write to truly forge the tools for his own escape.
And he came up with this ingenious plan to steal his education. First, he'd trade bread with poor white boys in exchange for reading lessons. Next, he taught himself the alphabet by copying the letters he saw ship carpenters use to mark timber, L for larboard, S for starboard. And finally, he would practice his handwriting in secret, using the blank spaces in his young master's old schoolbooks.
But this mission to learn how to write wasn't just about self-expression. No, it was deeply practical. Douglass knew that to escape to the north, he would probably need to forge his own travel pass. For him, learning to write was literally learning how to create his own permission slip to freedom.
And this brings us right back to where we started. By seizing an education for himself, Douglass was doing way more than just planning an escape. He was preparing himself to become one of those lions who would finally write history.
Literacy was his act of liberation. It was the process he used to reclaim his own humanity in a system that was designed to strip it away from him. He flat out refused to be just a character in someone else's story. He became the author of his own.
In the end, his narrative did so much more than just tell his story. It became a powerful weapon in the fight against slavery itself. It exposed the system's lies by presenting the undeniable truth of one man's experience, forcing a whole nation to confront a reality it was trying so hard to ignore. And it leaves us with a question for our own time. What is the power of a single, authentic voice today?